In this tutorial, I would like to show you how to create a 3D layout that will be useful for you in the future if you do a project, to plan ahead what assets do you need in your scene, how the camera is going to be positioned and how it's going to be moved, what's going to be the timing of the shot, and so on and so forth. So this is a very good visualization of either your film or your movie that you're doing. And as you can see, that most of the huge companies are doing that because that really helps them to minimize the problematic situations that they might have if they start a production without actually planning ahead visual storytelling. So in my case, I chose this storyboard that was done by one student, and I would like to create several scenes out of it. And pretty much if you are doing a 3D layout animation, you don't have to create all the animation of the characters. What you should do is plan ahead the main kind of poses. Maybe if your characters are sitting near the table, then of course you have to make a pose that they're sitting near the table. If they're running away, then you have to make several poses that demonstrate that visually. Then also, if your camera is moving, of course your camera should be moving as well. So in order to make a 3D layout, of course you will need some objects and props, as well as the characters if you have some characters in your scene. So in my case, I didn't want to actually model all this stuff, and I think in your case as well, because not many of you want to actually become a modeler and they don't have that skills. So if you want, you can just download the rigs or the objects from the websites where you can download some 3D assets. And in my case, I found a warrior, and as you can see, I selected free as well as Blender version. But that's because I'm working in Blender and I need my rig done in Blender. And you can see if you go to the object, there's a description on the right, and you can see that after the rigged, it says yes, so it is rigged, and I will be able to manipulate the character. So after that, I click download, and then it goes to this page where I can click on the expand and then select the objects in the format that I need. In my case, it's Blender. If you're downloading some landscapes or props or objects that are not moving, that are mostly still, you can just download it in the format of OBJ, which is basically just a mesh without any bones, without any rigs. Now, what is rig and what is bones? So in order to understand what the rig is and why do we need it, I'll demonstrate a short example. Now, if you create a box and make this mesh with certain segments, like in this case I have several segments for the box, I will be able to bend it and stretch it and move it in all different kind of ways. So, but for that I need to create certain controllers, or in my case those are bones, which will deform the object. So that's why I create an armature. As you can see, I add a bone, and then I move it inside the object because it's going to be influencing that object from the inside out. And then I add additional bones that will move each of the segments of the object. As you can see, if I move it in edit mode, it's not going to move the whole armature. You have to go to the pose mode and then select all of them or each one of them and move them. In order to skin it, you have to select the mesh and then select the bone and then select the connected with automatic weights. This will create all these vertex groups that you can find in the vertex tab or mesh tab. Next stage would be to skin it up, and the skinning process is basically saying that if I move this bone, it's going to move this vertices of the object. So now if I go back to the pose mode for the armature, I can move that armature and the mesh is going to move along it. And as you can see, I can animate that armature by selecting it, clicking S, selecting the certain properties that I want to make a key for example, location and rotation. And then while my automatic keyframe is turned on, I can move the object, rotate the object, and it's going to fixate that position as a keyframe. That way, each time I move it, it's going to be another keyframe, and if I play it back, it's going to be an animation. The program is creating all the in-betweens that you need, so you don't have to create, just like in stop motion, each frame. You just have to specify the pose A and pose B, and it's going to create all the in-betweens for you. And I'm basically adding additional modifiers to make it smooth, add additional material, add sunlight to make it appealing, and that's it. Now, most of the rigs are done so you will not see the bones by themselves, but you will see like a custom shapes. So in order to make them, you select it in pose mode and then individually apply that custom shape that is basically a simple null object or a mesh object. And that's better instead of all these bones that are inside the mesh. Now, the most important part is that if you rig the objects, you will never move the mesh without the rig. So basically, if it's already rigged, that is, you say that your mesh is already under the influence of the armature. So if you want to move the mesh, you have to move the armature in order to move it. And if you don't want to move your mesh accidentally, you have to go to the outliner and select the mesh that you want. And if you don't see the mesh in your outliner, you have to select it in the 3D view, and then in the outliner press F. It will find the object, show it to you, and then you will have to just deselect the arrow icon that will let the Blender know that you don't want this object to be selectable. And of course, for the most advanced rigging, you'll see that you have an advanced rigging system that is constructed out of many different bones and many different constraints that help the animator to just move the objects easily without thinking about all this confusing and very complicated stuff. So on the outside, it is very simplified, but on the inside, you'll have all the bones and structures. Now, there is a lot of good solutions for animators if they don't want to rig the character. There is an auto rig that you can just add an auto rig armature into your scene, and that will create all the parts you need for your character, all the limbs, all the fingers, all the bones, additional bones and stuff that will help you to move your objects. Now, after I align all the bones to the character, I can actually generate the rig using the Autogenerate Rig button. And what will it do is basically create, it will create an auto-generated rig for me that I can use for the animation. And as you can see, there's a lot of controllers on the character. And there's also on the right, there's a shelf where you can turn off or on all the controllers that you need. And right now, basically, if I move those controls, the mesh will not move. So that means that the mesh is not connected to the bone structure. Now, in order to connect it, you have to select what type of bones you want your mesh to be influenced by. And those are the deformation bones. And they are located on this layer, which I select right now. And if I select it alone, you will see all the deformation bones. Now we have to go back to the object mode and select the mesh of the character and then the bones, and then do pretty much the same stuff. Armature deform with automated weights. And this will create all the deformation vertex groups that are basically skinned to the bones. Now if I go back out of the deformation bones and only select the important controllers, and if I start moving them, you will see that my mesh is start deforming. Now there might be some bad deformations as well, and that's because automatic weights might not be perfect all the time. So you have to skin it by yourself to say what parts of the mesh should move with what deformation bone. In my case, I have some problems with props that she's wearing, also with the skirt, so I have to do some weights on her in order to make it much better, but that's not even enough, and you might work long hours to actually make it perfect. So that's why we have a profession called rigger, and those people are only working on making rig plausible and easy to use for the animators. So the animators don't have to think about. And as you can see, my character is pretty much done, although of course it's not perfect, but I can make some shape keys that will make her smile, open the mouth, etc. And by just easily creating the shape key and adjusting the mesh the way I want it, almost like sculpting the mesh. And that's pretty much it for the rigging part. So of course you can just download the rig that you want, and then you will just have to open it in your 3D scene. So let's do that. And I usually make a folder for my projects where I store all the objects and all the characters out of the scene, and then I can import it in my Blender scene. by just clicking File, Import, and OBG, and that's for the files with OBG format. So then I click on OBG file and it's going to load it up. As you can see, it's pretty huge object, and that's why it's occupying a lot of space and we cannot really see it. Now that happens sometimes, so you have to create a certain object that will scale it down. Well, you can scale it down by yourself usually, but in my case I think that it's a lot easier if you create an empty and then parent all the objects to that empty and then scale it down. You can scale it without an empty. Now I just select all the objects in the scene and then deselect the empty and then select it again and then press P and then parent with offsets. And what it does is basically parenting all the objects to that empty, and then I can scale the empty and it will scale all the objects that are inside that hierarchy. Now after I've done that, I start moving all the objects the way I need it, and actually I thought that I'll use those objects, but at the end I decided not to. So next part would be to import the character. Now, because our character is Blender file and it's not the OBG or any other format, we have to click File and Append. Now, there's also a link button, but a link is something complicated which I cannot explain in this tutorial, but maybe next one. So you have to click Append and then go to your Blender file with your warrior or any character that you want to import in your scene, and then just go into the warrior Blender file and you will see all the folders, and you have to go to the object folders and select all of them by clicking Ctrl A and then deselecting the active layer, because I don't want to put everything on one layer. I want to put it on any other layer that it was originally located in, so I don't want to merge all of them into one. But apparently it was made on one layer, so it was just imported as one layer. As you can see, there is a mesh, and there is also bones. So I'm just switching to cycle render. That's because a cycle render is much more realistic, and you will see that at the end. Just don't really confuse yourself with all this stuff for now. Then let's work on our armature. So if you select the armature, which is Meta Rig in this case, you can see the icon with the character. That means that this is not a mesh, this is an armature. And if you start actually going into the pose mode and selecting all the bones that they are, say for example a leg or an arm, you'll be able to rotate it and move it the way you want it and position the objects. Now this rig is not very perfect and there is no IK, and if you know what is IK, which is inverse kinematic, you will understand that it's a very nice thing for animators. But there is no IK and it's pretty much all simple FK rig. But it's fine for the demonstration, so I'm just gonna keep it like this way. Now, in my case, textures of the objects were not in the same folder, that's why they were lost. That's why my character is pink and all the other assets as well. And that's why I have to specify the texture. Now, in order to do that, I had to press on use nodes and then select the color and pick the image texture. Next, I have to select the untitled, but untitled is not in the scene, so that's why it's still purple. Click on the folder to select the texture, and then I go to the warrior texture folder and then click untitled. And as you can see now, it assigned it to our mesh. Now, of course, it's not perfect, and it's not going to be perfect till we create all the textures for the scene, but that's fine for the layout version. As you can see, I also switch between different modes, which is texture mode, solid mode, and material mode. Basically, solid mode is no textures, and textured or material is with texture. And actually, I noticed that my character is a bit small. So I had to scale it up a little bit and move it away. Now we have a camera in our scene, but we have to specify it for our properties to actually use that camera as a render camera. So next I go to the storyboard and see how my shots are created. So basically looking at my planning, and now I have to set up my camera so that it's behind the character, but behind the character there's a tree, so I moved the character a little bit forward, and then I need to move my camera. But before I do that, I actually move my view into a position where I want my camera to be, and then by selecting the camera and then aligning the camera to the view, I'm able to quickly align it and position it the way I want it. Now if you rotate your camera, you will see that you're going out of your camera, so that's because you didn't lock your camera to the view. After you clicked it in the properties, you will be able to position your camera the way you want it, but be sure to unlock the camera whenever you want to go out of the camera or whenever you want to zoom in the view. So now I see that the character is moving to the light, and that the camera is well moving to the lights with that character. But before I do the animation, I noticed that my character already had some animation keys inside the armature. So I had to select the Meta Rig and then go to the pose mode, select all the bones, and then go to the pose animation and then clear all the animation. Now we don't have any keys and we can position our character the way we want it in our scene. I just released some arms so that it's more natural looking. Of course, we will not see all the arms and legs in our shot as we planned it in our storyboard, but that's fine. Now I animate characters, so I went to the object mode, and basically if I move the armature in the object mode, this will move the whole armature with all the bones in this case, and just move the whole object, which is the meta rig, forward, and create a keyframe. And now if you play the animation, you will see that your character is moving forward. Next I go into the camera, and then I also create a keyframe, then go to the last keyframe, and then also move my camera along with the character. But if I calculate the motion pass, you'll see that there is some slow out and slow in, which was automatically created. And as I can see in storyboard, there is no slow out or slow in. So I think the camera is just moving linearly. We have to go to the graph editor, select the object, open up a new tab, but just moving that crossing arrows thing by the corner, and then turning the 3D view into graph editor. And by clicking shift space, I'm able to go into this full view. I can select all the keyframes and make them vector based, which is linear. If I update the motion pass, you will see that it's now evenly spaced, which means that there is no is out and is in. Now select the meta rig and also make it vector based, so now it moves linearly in the scene. Now my scene is pretty much done. The only thing is that we need some additional motion, maybe because our character is moving forward. If you observe how the character is moving from the back view, you'll see that usually character goes up and down, up and down, up and down. This motion, something that we'll need to add in order to simulate this walk kind of cycle of the character. Now, as you can see, I actually converted the outliner view into a 3D view, and I'm able to see from camera, if I select the camera, if I zoom in a little bit, and then I will be able to see what's happening in the camera while also working in the perspective view. This is very nice. In a dope sheet, actually, I will create additional keyframes. Now, I wanted to copy the keyframes, but because I selected all the keyframes, that means it copied all the keyframes of the scene. Now in my case, I only want to copy the keyframes of the armature, so I select the arrow button which says only show everything that is selected in the graph in the dope sheet. Now I also want only up and down motion, so I don't have to copy all the channels. And as you know, in 3D view you have 3 channels, which is X, Y, and Z. So in my case, I only need the blue arrow, which is Z axis. So I have to actually select it in the dope sheet, and as you can see, that's the keyframe that I need to copy. So now, because I have 3 keyframes, which is up, down, up, we simulated the motion similar to walk cycle. And then I can just select those keys and duplicate them by clicking Ctrl D, duplicating them, and so on. Now the last keyframe is not correct, so I just moved it over the last key so that we don't have duplicates. Now it's a little bit fast for me, so I decided to remove the last key and then select all the keyframes that we created and then scale it up by clicking S and scaling till the end. Now it's a little bit slower, but it's still a little bumpy. If you go to Graph Editor and zoom in, if you click Normalize, then if you click F, you'll always see it zoomed in. So as you can see, that's why we have very strange movements, because the graph, because it's very spiky, very not very smooth. So I have to go and select the channel again, which is Z allocation. And then because I want to see only this channel and not all the other channels, I have to click on View and then click Only Selected Channels. This way I can select only this channel and then convert it into auto clamp, which is smooth, is in, is out interpolation. Now if I go to the camera view again, you will see that this shot is pretty much done. The only thing I need in this shot is some lighting. So if I render it out, so I click on this, render it out, and be patient because it's very slow. It takes a lot of CPU and also GPU. In my case, it's very slow and it's very hard to go back to the material mode. And I removed all the lighting in my case because I don't need these custom lights. I need only sunlight. I really want to keep it simple. And then if I go back to the outliner, and then I can see that there's only sun and the camera, which is nice. We don't have all the other lights that are not necessary. Now if I click rendered, you will see that the sun is pretty much lighting up everything from the top, but I need it not like in, I want it to be almost like a sunrise or a sunset, so I have to keep I had to rotate my light a little bit so that it's shining from below or almost from below. This makes my shadows closer to what the sunset or sunrise. And then I also adjusted some strength value because I thought that the sound was a little bit too dim and I have to make it brighter. The size, if you adjust it to 1, the shadows will become very smooth. But if you make it lower value, it will make it more crisper. So that depends on you. And then I also changed the material for the ground because it was very bright and I want it to be a little bit darker. So I make it roughly black, and that's pretty much it. So you can render the scene, but I noticed that there's also a rock kind of around the scene. So I decided that I can just copy that rocks. But before I do that, I need to remove the arrow, actually turn on the arrow sign, which means make it selectable again. And then I click on those rocks and move them, also rotate them. Position them basically almost similar to the storyboard planning. And I also duplicated the rock and just scaled it in negative to make it mirror, and then just rotated it around. But be sure to turn off the auto keyframe so that you accidentally not make some animation onto your objects, which is supposed to be static. So now if I render the scene, you will see that there is a nice kind of composition done. The only thing that is strange is that all those objects are purple or like pink color, which is not the color that I need. So I had to go to the material tab and with the rocks selected, make it green, gray kind of color, not very saturated. So if you go to HSV, you can drop down the saturation, making it more gray and not very colorful. And this made my scene very nice. So I thought that why not removing all the other objects which are not necessary, and this will make your rendering a little bit faster because computer will not have to render all these objects. So, and then you can just render your animation. So to render, you have to go to the render tab and then make the resolution higher to 100% so it doesn't crop it up. By the way, check FPS, the frames per second, to make it 24. It's not. Also, go to the output and select the folder where you want your animation to be rendered in. It might be the same folder where you keep all your project files. And then you click the PNG format into AVI JPEG format, and basically now you're done. You can click animation and render it. But if you do that, what you will have is the computer will render your animation very slowly because it's going to calculate all the lights, all the lighting and all the materials in the scene to make it perfect. And this takes a lot of time, so I decided why not just using OpenGL rendering, which means render it like it is in the viewport, so don't calculate all the lights. So in this case, you just have to turn on the render display, only render. This will remove all the bones and all this stuff that is not needed, and then click on render animation button. This will render in the same folder with the same format as you specified. Now, as you can see, it's a lot faster, but it doesn't calculate any lighting, any materials. It only calculate the textures. But this is fine for me, and I can go to the next shot. Now in the next shot, as I can see, there's a camera in another position which is pointing at the legs. And I could think that those legs are moving, which is basically our character is either walking or running. I think in our case it's walking because it's a continuation of the previous shot. So I basically save my scene as scene 1, and then I save it as another scene, as a scene 2. And basically what I do is I remove all the animation from the camera because now the camera is going to be in a different position. But the character is pretty much moving in the same position as it was in the previous shot. So I move my camera where I need it to be. Now, of course, as you can see, my auto keyframe is turned off because I'm just positioning my camera for now. I don't add any keyframes yet. And after I position my camera in the way I need it, I can then also specify some parameters for the camera. Like if those who are familiar with photography, they know what is focal length, and you can specify a more suitable for portraits or more suitable for landscape focal length, and it's easy to do here. Now I decided to use more portrait length, which is around 50 millimeters. So then I want my camera to move with the legs. So as you can see right now, if I move the object, it is moving by this almost like on a slider, and that's because of the global transformation is turned on. If you turn on to the local, it's basically going to move along the object rotation axis. But in our case, we wanted to move along the global with the character. So I positioned it at the first frame where they're closer to the person on one side, and then on the other frame to the next position, following the motion of the character. And then I just basically converted the keys into vector to make it linear. Now there's a difficult part that we need to go through, which is additional poses for this shot, because he's not sliding, he's moving, so he's kind of walking. So we have to create this additional poses for the character to make him look like he's walking. So what I did is I basically select armature and went to the pose mode, and then I go to the first frame. As you can see in the graph editor, there's already some keyframes, and those keyframes are basically done for the character going up and down. So we can use those keyframes as our main target keys or markers. So now in the first keyframe, I make my pose of the character with a contact pose of the legs. Basically, he's starting to move down. In the next pose, where he moved down, I need to bend him, so he's basically pushing all the weights on his leg, and another leg is just following through over the air. So the legs are crossing. You can also animate the arms, but then I thought that because it's not visible to the camera, you can pretty much ignore them. So then you go to the next frame, and you have to make it the opposite leg. Now this is a very nice trick you can use by selecting the bones on one side and then clicking copy the pose and selecting the other leg and then pasting the pose. Is basically going to paste it mirroring the position. So if you want to mirror the pose to the other side, you just basically click copy, go to that frame where you want to mirror it and click paste mirror. Now the next thing we have to do is we can just copy these poses by making a cycle out of them. So in order to do that, you just select all the armature bones and then select all the keyframes that we created, and then just copy them and paste them, and you will have a cycle of a character walking. So then you can go to the object mode and go to the camera view, and you can see how it's moving. Now I don't really like that the character is positioned pretty much in the center, and I think the composition is not that good. So that's why I say that 3D layout is very important. This is where you plan your composition, your animation, the movements in your scene beforehand, before you actually give it to the professional animator that will animate it based on the planning that you've done. And it's also a nice way to test it if it's gonna look nice or not nice. So now, because I want to move all my keyframes, or basically my camera, to a different position, I can work on the first frame, then move it to another position, and go to the last frame and move to another position, to the correct position. But I thought that it would be nice to just work in a graph editor and just move those axes up and down. By doing that, you're basically changing the position of the object by those axes. After I moved my camera in the correct position, I can add additional objects to the scene, which is a rock on the ground, help the audience to understand that he's moving forward. Those kind of additional visual things help to track where the character is going or where the camera is moving. So now we have the second shot, and that's pretty much it. So you can build up the third shot, the fourth shot, etc. And then what you need to do is just combine all of those shots, and you will have a 3D planning completed. Thanks for watching, and I hope this tutorial was not very hard for you, but was very helpful and interesting, and see you later.